Margaret Whitmore is mentally unstable and unfit to manage the estate of her late husband. That was the sentence my own mother asked a lawyer to read aloud in a quiet probate conference room less than 3 weeks after I buried Edward. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply folded my hands on the polished oak table and let the words settle in the air like dust in sunlight. Grief had already hollowed out my world. They mistook that silence for weakness. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper, the kind of place where decisions are made in calm voices that can rearrange a life in under an hour. My father, Harold Collins, sat across from me in his navy blazer, his expression carefully composed, as if this were a business negotiation instead of a declaration that his only daughter had lost her mind. My mother, Diane, dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue she did not need. Their attorney spoke in measured tones about concerns, about my emotional state, about the responsibility of overseeing a $4 million estate. $4 million. They said it softly, but the number hung heavy. Edward had built that wealth over 40 years in commercial real estate, one renovated strip mall and office complex at a time, while I handled the books at our kitchen table and met contractors with coffee and spreadsheets. I knew every property address by heart. I knew which tenants paid early and which needed reminders. Yet now, according to my parents, I was incapable of signing a check. The petition they filed sought temporary guardianship over the estate, arguing that my recent loss had rendered me mentally unfit to manage complex financial matters. It sounded clinical, responsible, protective. That was the brilliance of it. They were not stealing, they were helping. I glanced down at the copy of the petition in front of me. My name appeared again and again beside phrases like diminished capacity and impaired judgment. I traced the letters of my own name with my finger, steady and deliberate. 3 nights earlier, I had stood alone in the master bedroom Edward and I shared for 38 years, staring at the empty indentation on his side of the mattress. I had sorted condolence cards into neat stacks. I had canceled his cell phone plan. I had met with our accountant and reviewed quarterly statements without missing a single figure. Grief does not erase arithmetic. My parents began visiting daily after the funeral, bringing casseroles and unsolicited advice. They asked how I was sleeping, whether I was remembering to take my blood pressure medication, whether I felt confused handling paperwork. At the time, I thought they were worried. Now I understood they were collecting details, building a portrait of fragility. My father leaned forward in the conference room and said gently, "We just want to make sure you're protected, Maggie." He has called me Maggie since I was 5. The familiarity might have comforted me once. Today, it felt strategic. I lifted my gaze and met his eyes. Protected from what? I asked quietly. The attorney shifted in his seat. My mother sighed, as if the question itself proved their point. I could feel the weight of their plan pressing in, but beneath that pressure something steadier was forming. Edward had always said that in business, the person who keeps their voice calm holds the advantage. I straightened the stack of papers in front of me and allowed a small, almost polite smile. They believed they were watching a widow unravel. They did not realize I had already begun paying attention, and I had the proof to show exactly who in that room was unfit to be trusted. 3 days before that meeting, the house felt larger than it had in decades. Not because anything had changed, but because Edward was no longer moving through it. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked too loudly. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen as if it were trying to fill the silence. I woke before sunrise, as I always had, and reached for the other side of the bed out of habit. My hand met cool sheets. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan turning in slow, steady circles, and forced myself to sit up. Grief has a weight to it, but it does not steal your memory or your reason. I brewed coffee the way Edward liked it, strong and dark, even though I was the only one drinking it now. Then I opened my laptop at the dining room table and logged into the estate account. $4 million sounds abstract when lawyers say it. On the screen, it was lines of numbers, property codes, scheduled transfers, insurance, policies, and quarterly projections. I reviewed each entry carefully, the way I had for years. Nothing looked unusual. No missing funds. No unauthorized withdrawals. The system we built was still intact. Later that morning, my mother arrived unannounced with a casserole wrapped in foil. She set it on the counter and walked slowly through the house, glancing at framed photographs as if taking inventory. "Are you sure you should be handling all this alone?" she asked, nodding toward my laptop. It is a lot for someone in your condition. I asked her what condition she meant. She smiled softly and said, You have not been yourself since the funeral. I wondered what version of myself she expected to see. The one who could recite lease terms from memory, or the one who had just lost her husband of nearly 4 decades. My father came by that evening with a stack of documents printed from the county probate website. He said he thought it would be helpful if we looked at them together. He pointed to sections about fiduciary responsibility and complex asset management, emphasizing phrases like legal liability and cognitive burden. He spoke slowly, as though explaining something delicate. I listened without interrupting. What neither of them realized was that Edward and I had anticipated disputes long before he ever became ill. We had sat at this same table 2 years earlier and discussed worst-case scenarios, not in fear, but in preparation. He insisted that I keep digital copies of every contract, every amendment, every email exchange related to the business. He trusted me with everything because I had been beside him for every negotiation. That afternoon, after my parents left, I opened a secure folder Edward created labeled Continuity. Inside were time-stamped financial summaries, notarized statements, and a letter addressed to me in his steady handwriting. It was not sentimental. It was practical. He listed the passwords to backup accounts and the contact information for an independent forensic accountant he respected. I sat back in my chair and read the letter twice. Outside, a delivery truck rolled down the street, and children laughed somewhere in the distance. Life continued, indifferent to probate filings and whispered doubts about my sanity. I closed the laptop gently and looked around the quiet house. They believed grief had clouded my judgment. They had not noticed that I was documenting every conversation, saving every message, and reviewing every record with more clarity than ever before. I was not unraveling. I was preparing. The anonymous email arrived at 9:23 in the morning while I was reviewing property tax assessments for our retail plaza in Columbus. The subject line read, Check your probate file. There was no greeting, no signature, just a single sentence in the body. They filed more than you think. For a moment, I stared at the screen, listening to the steady ticking of the hallway clock. I did not panic. I opened a new browser tab and logged into the county probate portal using the case number printed on the initial petition. The filing history loaded slowly, line by line. There it was. An amended petition submitted 48 hours after the original guardianship request. I clicked on the document and felt something inside me go very still. My parents had included an affidavit claiming that I had shown signs of severe emotional instability, impaired concentration, and confusion regarding financial decisions. They cited conversations that had supposedly taken place in my kitchen, statements I did not remember making because I had never made them. They even referenced concerns from a primary care physician about my mental health. That was the first time my pulse quickened. I had seen my doctor for a routine blood pressure check 2 months earlier. Nothing more. I reached for my phone and called the clinic. After navigating through automated prompts, I spoke with the nurse who confirmed that my medical record showed no diagnosis related to cognitive decline or psychological impairment. I requested a complete copy of my file to be sent directly to me. When I hung up, I opened the affidavit again and read each sentence carefully, not as a daughter, but as someone accustomed to contracts and liability clauses. The language was deliberate. It painted a picture of a grieving widow who could not be trusted with complex assets. It implied urgency, as if the estate were in imminent danger under my supervision. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet settle around me. Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere down the block. The ordinary sound felt grounding. They were building a narrative. I began building a record. I saved screenshots of the probate filings, noting the timestamps. I printed the amended petition and highlighted every factual claim. Then I opened the continuity folder again and located Edward's notarized statement affirming my full authority and competence in managing our business affairs. It was dated 6 months before his passing, clear and unequivocal. I also found email exchanges between Edward and our accountant discussing my role as primary financial decision-maker. None of this felt dramatic. It felt methodical. Later that afternoon, my father called. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He asked whether I had considered stepping back from the stress of managing everything alone. I told him I appreciated his concern. I did not mention the amended petition. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him certain that his strategy was working. After we ended the call, I placed my phone face down on the table and stared at the framed photograph of Edward on the sideboard. He was smiling in that picture, sleeves rolled up, standing in front of one of our first renovation projects. We had worked too hard for me to surrender control because someone labeled my grief as instability. I returned to my desk and drafted an email to Daniel Brooks, attaching the new filings and requesting an urgent meeting. If they intended to question my sanity in a courtroom, I would answer them with documentation, timelines, and facts. They believed they were defining me with a single word. They had no idea how much evidence I had already gathered to define the truth instead. Daniel Brooks responded within an hour and asked me to come to his office the following morning. His tone over the phone was measured, but there was an edge beneath it, the kind that appears when a professional realizes a line has been crossed. I arrived at 10 sharp, wearing the same navy suit I had worn to Edward's final board meeting. The fabric felt steadier than I did, structured and composed. Daniel closed the door behind me and placed a printed copy of the amended petition on his desk. He had highlighted entire paragraphs. "They escalated," he said quietly. I nodded. I saw. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me carefully, not as an attorney evaluating a client, but as someone assessing clarity. "Margaret, I need to ask you directly. Are you managing the accounts without difficulty?" The question did not offend me. It grounded me. "Yes," I said. "I reviewed the quarterly statements yesterday. The Columbus property tax adjustment is pending, and the Cincinnati lease renewal is due next month. I already drafted the response." He held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Good," he replied. "Because their affidavit claims you forgot to pay 2 utility invoices and seemed confused about your own trust structure." I allowed myself a brief, almost incredulous smile. "The invoices were scheduled for automatic payment," I said, "and I revised the trust structure with Edward last year. I have the notarized amendment." Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "They also contacted your physician." I told him I had already requested my medical file. I explained that there was no record of cognitive impairment, no psychiatric evaluation suggesting instability. Daniel tapped the petition lightly with his pen. "They are attempting to create a pattern," he said. "Small incidents, reframed as evidence." I folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had in the probate conference room. "Then we will create a clearer pattern," I replied. For the next hour, we reviewed documentation. I provided copies of email exchanges between Edward and our accountant confirming my oversight of the estate. I showed Daniel the continuity folder Edward had prepared, including the independent forensic accountant's contact information. Daniel's expression shifted from concern to focus. "This helps," he said, "especially the timeline." When I left his office, the sky was overcast, a thin gray sheet stretching across the afternoon. I drove home slowly, thinking not about anger, but about precision. That evening, my mother called again. Her voice carried a practiced softness. She asked whether I had considered undergoing a formal evaluation to put everyone at ease. I told her I would think about it. I did not tell her that I had already scheduled a comprehensive cognitive assessment with a board-certified neuropsychologist recommended by Daniel. If they intended to question my competence, I would answer with data. After the call, I sat at the dining room table and opened a legal pad. I began writing down every interaction I had with my parents since the funeral, noting dates, times, and exact phrases. I documented their questions about medication, their comments about my memory, their insistence that I rest instead of reviewing documents. Patterns are easier to see when placed side by side. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the heating system. I paused and looked toward the hallway where Edward's framed degrees still hung straight and undisturbed. They believed they were building a case about my decline. They did not realize they were leaving a trail of their own intentions. And I was no longer simply reacting. I was assembling something stronger than grief, stronger than accusation. I was assembling proof. The neuropsychological evaluation took place in a quiet medical office 40 minutes from my home, in a brick building with neatly trimmed hedges and a flag moving slowly in the breeze. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather folder filled with financial summaries and personal identification, not because I needed them for the tests, but because I wanted to remind myself of the life I had built. The specialist, Dr. Elaine Foster, greeted me with a firm handshake and clear eyes. She explained each assessment carefully, memory recall exercises, problem-solving tasks, financial reasoning scenarios, and standardized cognitive measurements used in court proceedings. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was structured, methodical, almost clinical in its calm. For nearly 3 hours I answered questions, repeated number sequences, interpreted written passages, and completed logic puzzles. At one point, she presented a hypothetical scenario involving the management of multiple rental properties with fluctuating cash flow. I outlined a reserve strategy, insurance coverage adjustments, and tenant risk assessment without hesitation. She watched me closely, occasionally making notes. I did not rush. I did not perform. I simply responded the way I always had in board meetings and planning sessions. When we finished, she closed the file and offered a small, professional smile. Your cognitive performance is well within the high average range for your age group, she said. There are no indicators of impairment. The words settled into me with quiet certainty. I asked whether her report would be suitable for legal review. She assured me it would include objective scoring, comparative benchmarks, and a direct statement addressing competence in financial decision-making. I scheduled a follow-up appointment to collect the finalized document and drove home with the radio off, letting the silence feel different this time. It was no longer heavy. It was steady. That evening, I opened my email and found another message from my father. He wrote that he was worried about my ability to handle stress and that several neighbors had mentioned I seemed distracted. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. I saved the message to a separate folder labeled evidence. Then I reviewed the visitor logs from the small security system Edward had installed 2 years earlier after a minor break-in on our street. The camera by the front door recorded timestamps for every entry. According to the footage, my parents had accessed the house on 3 occasions while I was at the grocery store or meeting with Daniel. Each visit lasted less than 15 minutes. I scrolled through the video clips and watched my father move directly toward the study where the estate documents were stored. He did not linger. He did not look uncertain. He looked purposeful. I copied the clips onto an external drive and noted the dates beside my written log of their visits. The pattern sharpened. Concern expressed publicly. Access requested privately. Allegations filed formally. I sat at the dining room table and placed Dr. Foster's preliminary summary beside the printed affidavit my parents had submitted. 2 narratives lay side by side. One built on assumption and suggestion. The other grounded in measurable data. I ran my hand over the edge of the paper and felt something stronger than relief. It was clarity. They believed a label would be enough to displace me. They underestimated the discipline of someone who has balanced books for 4 decades without missing a decimal. If they intended to question my competence in a courtroom, they would be standing against documented performance, medical evaluation, recorded timelines, and their own contradictions. And for the first time since Edward's passing, I felt not just prepared, but positioned. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning in a probate courtroom that looked more like a modest conference hall than a place where families quietly dismantled each other. I arrived early, carrying a slim leather briefcase that felt lighter than it had in weeks. Inside were Dr. Foster's finalized evaluation, certified copies of Edward's amended trust, printed security footage logs, and a neatly organized timeline of every interaction I had documented. Daniel met me near the entrance and gave a subtle nod, the kind that said we were not reacting anymore. We were presenting. My parents were already seated on the opposite side of the room. My mother wore a pale gray suit and an expression of restrained sorrow. My father kept his hands folded, eyes lowered as if burdened by difficult responsibility. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The proceedings began with their attorney reiterating concerns about my emotional instability and diminished executive function. The phrases sounded polished, rehearsed, almost sympathetic. I listened without interrupting, my posture straight, my breathing steady. When it was Daniel's turn, he did not argue immediately. He handed the clerk a packet of documents first. Evidence before emotion. He began by introducing the independent neuropsychological report, emphasizing the objective scoring, the standardized testing, and the clear conclusion that I demonstrated no cognitive impairment. The judge read portions silently, occasionally adjusting her glasses. Then Daniel presented Edward's notarized statement affirming my authority over every financial decision made in the past 5 years. He submitted email correspondence between Edward, our accountant, and me that showed detailed strategic planning, projections, and executed transactions. There was no confusion in those exchanges. There was structure, precision, and accountability. Finally, Daniel referenced the security footage. He did not dramatize it. He simply noted that while I was at documented appointments, my parents accessed the home office where estate records were kept, despite later claiming I was too unstable to manage basic tasks. The judge looked toward my parents for clarification. My father shifted slightly in his seat. My mother's composure faltered just enough to register. When I was asked whether I wished to speak, I stood. My voice did not tremble. I explained that grief and incapacity are not interchangeable. I described my daily review of accounts, the pending lease renewals, and the tax adjustments in progress. I stated clearly that I had sought independent evaluation not because I doubted myself, but because I understood the seriousness of legal allegations. The courtroom was quiet. There was no raised voice, no dramatic exchange. Only documentation laid beside accusation. After a brief recess, the judge returned and delivered her ruling. The petition for guardianship was denied due to lack of credible evidence and the presence of substantial documentation supporting my competence. She noted that emotional distress following a spouse's death does not equate to legal incapacity. The words were measured, almost understated, but they carried weight. As we gathered our papers, my parents avoided my eyes. I did not approach them. I did not accuse them. I simply closed my briefcase and walked toward the exit, with Daniel at my side. Outside, the late morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting a steady light across the courthouse steps. I paused for a moment, not in triumph, but in recognition. They had attempted to define me through suggestion and doubt. I had answered with records, evaluations, and truth. And in the end, it was not anger that protected me. It was preparation. In the days that followed the hearing, the house felt different again, not lighter exactly, but clearer. The uncertainty that had lingered in every room had been replaced with something steadier, like air after a storm has passed. I returned to my routines without ceremony. I reviewed rent deposits, confirmed insurance renewals, and met with the property manager for the Dayton office complex over coffee at a small cafe downtown. He spoke about maintenance schedules and upcoming lease negotiations, and I responded the way I always had, asking direct questions, outlining contingencies, adjusting projections with a pen on a yellow legal pad. Business did not pause for family conflict. It never had. Late one afternoon, I received a formal letter from my parents' attorney stating that they would not pursue further legal action. The wording was polite, almost sterile, as if the entire ordeal had been a misunderstanding rather than a calculated attempt to remove me from control of my own life. I placed the letter beside the judge's ruling and read them together. One represented accusation. The other represented dismissal. Neither required an emotional reaction. That evening, my mother called. Her voice carried none of the earlier softness. It sounded smaller, uncertain. She said they had only been trying to help, that they were worried I would be overwhelmed. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her calmly that help does not begin with a petition for guardianship. There was silence on the line, the kind that stretches longer than comfort allows. My father did not speak. I imagined him standing nearby, listening, perhaps realizing that concern had become something else entirely. I did not accuse them. I did not revisit every documented detail. I simply stated that trust, once questioned in court, does not return easily. After the call ended, I walked through the house slowly. The study door was open, sunlight resting across Edward's desk. I ran my hand along the polished wood where he used to spread out blueprints and contracts. For weeks, that room had felt like a battlefield. Now it felt like an office again. I opened the drawer where the continuity folder was stored and placed Dr. Foster's final report inside, alongside the security footage copies and the court documents. Not as trophies, as records. The estate accounts were stable. The properties were performing as projected. Nothing had collapsed under the weight of accusation. The next morning, I met Daniel for a brief follow-up. He confirmed that the case was officially closed and that the court record reflected the denial of incapacity. "You handled this with remarkable composure," he said. I thanked him, though composure had not been strategy. It had been necessity. Outside his office, traffic moved steadily along Main Street, people crossing at the light without awareness of the quiet war that had just concluded inside a probate file. When I returned home, I sat at the dining room table with a cup of coffee and looked around at the walls that had witnessed everything. Grief was still there. It did not disappear because a judge ruled in my favor, but it no longer stood alone. It was accompanied by clarity, by proof, by the undeniable fact that my mind had never been the fragile thing they tried to portray. They had attempted to question my stability in a courtroom. What they revealed instead was their own willingness to trade trust for control. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something with complete certainty. My capacity had never been the issue. Their integrity had been. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of my days returned to something almost familiar. I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee, and reviewed the estate reports while the sky shifted from gray to pale blue beyond the kitchen windows. Lease agreements were signed. Maintenance invoices were approved. A small retail space in Columbus secured a new long-term tenant, and the numbers aligned exactly as projected. Stability, once questioned in a courtroom, now revealed itself quietly in spreadsheets and bank statements. One afternoon, I received a certified letter from the county clerk confirming that the guardianship petition had been permanently dismissed and sealed in accordance with the judge's recommendation. The envelope was thick, official, the paper inside crisp and final. I sat at the dining room table and opened it slowly, reading each line with steady eyes. There. It was in formal language, insufficient evidence, credible documentation, demonstrated competence. Words that carried legal weight, not emotion. I placed the letter beside Edward's framed photograph and allowed myself a long breath. Not a triumphant one, a measured one. Later that week, I made an appointment with the independent forensic accountant Edward had once mentioned in passing. Not because anything was missing, but because I wanted a comprehensive audit completed and documented for the record. If anyone ever questioned my management again, I intended to answer before they asked. The audit confirmed what I already knew. The estate was solvent, diversified, and responsibly maintained. Every property tax payment had been submitted on time. Every insurance policy was active. Every transaction aligned with standard fiduciary practice. I kept a bound copy of the audit in the study, next to the trust documents. Not as defense, as discipline. My parents did not visit again. The silence between us stretched without resolution. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I walked through the garden Edward had planted years ago, running my fingers along the tops of trimmed hedges and newly blooming roses. The air carried the scent of cut grass and early fall. I thought about how quickly concern had transformed into control, how easily grief had been reframed as incapacity. I did not feel anger anymore. Anger requires heat. What remained was clarity. They had believed that labeling me unstable would make the narrative stick. They had underestimated the difference between emotion and evidence. In the evenings, I sat in the study with a legal pad and outlined future plans for the estate. Diversification into commercial storage units. A review of long-term capital gain strategies. Meetings with a financial planner to explore charitable foundations in Edward's name. Forward movement felt deliberate, not reactive. One afternoon, Daniel called to inform me that the court record reflected not only the dismissal, but also a notation that future petitions would require substantial new evidence. It was a subtle safeguard, a line drawn quietly in the official file. I thanked him and ended the call, then walked to the front window and looked out at the quiet street. Children rode bicycles past the house. A delivery truck paused at the corner. Ordinary life continued, unaware of the quiet attempt to displace me that had unfolded inside legal documents and whispered suggestions. I turned away from the window and returned to my desk. The estate accounts remained under my control. The records were organized. The future was mapped in careful, measurable steps. They had tried to define me by a moment of loss. What remained instead was a record of resilience, documented in ink, sealed in court filings, and reflected in every balanced ledger. And in the stillness of that house, I understood something with calm certainty. My mind had never been the fragile thing they described. It had been the one constant all along. Autumn settled in gradually, not with a dramatic shift, but with cooler mornings and longer shadows stretching across the driveway. I found comfort in the predictability of it. The estate reports continued to arrive at the beginning of each month, neat columns of numbers reflecting stability rather than suspicion. I approved maintenance budgets, authorized a modest renovation on the Dayton property, and finalized a charitable contribution in Edward's name to a local scholarship fund for business students. The foundation paperwork required detailed financial disclosures and long-term projections, and I completed each form with the same precision that had guided me through the courtroom weeks earlier. One evening, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. The envelope was thin, the handwriting slightly unsteady. She wrote that she regretted how things had unfolded, that fear had clouded her judgment, that she had believed she was protecting me from pressure I did not fully understand. I read the letter slowly at the dining room table where so much of this story had unfolded. There was no admission of strategy, no acknowledgement of the affidavits or the amended petitions, only a softened version of events shaped by hindsight. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer, not with bitterness, but with recognition. Trust, once tested in court, does not restore itself with sentiment alone. The following week, I met with Daniel one last time to review long-term estate planning adjustments. We updated beneficiary structures and added an additional clause reinforcing my sole authority unless medically certified by 2 independent specialists under strict criteria. It was not revenge. It was reinforcement. I left his office with a sense of completion rather than triumph. At home, I walked through each room deliberately. The study felt orderly. The kitchen carried the faint scent of brewed coffee. Edward's photograph remained on the sideboard, his expression steady and confident. I paused there, not in sadness, but in quiet acknowledgement. Grief had not made me fragile. It had made me attentive. It had forced me to see the difference between genuine support and subtle control. The estate remained intact. The records were clear. The future was structured around sustainability, not fear. As the weeks turned into months, conversations with my parents grew infrequent and measured. There were no more legal filings, no more veiled suggestions about evaluation or capacity. The court record stood as a quiet boundary between us. On a crisp November morning, I stood by the front window and watched leaves drift across the lawn. The house was still. The accounts were balanced. The documentation was filed. They had attempted to reduce me to a single accusation in a legal document. Instead, what remained was a detailed record of competence, discipline, and restraint. I did not need raised voices or public vindication. The ruling, the audit, the evaluation, and the structured future plan spoke clearly enough. In the end, the most powerful response was not anger. It was evidence. They had questioned my sanity. I had answered with proof. And in that answer, I reclaimed not just an estate, but the quiet certainty of who I have always been.